about who these guys are and why I'm involved with this and this message. I've traveled around the country. And so that's what the first table is about. Now, normally when I travel and do the full-blown presentation in costume and I act, and it's a big stage show, about an hour and 15-minute long, and I become different characters and all that. I bring a lot more of the Revolutionary War weapons, but I brought 4 of them and then 5 with that one. That pistol was owned by Paul Revere, the actual Paul Revere. And so it's an incredibly rare pistol, but I love for people, especially in smaller groups like this, to get to hold it, because it's very seldom will you get to hold something like that. Normally it's behind some glass, So anyway, most of you know who I am, so the reason why I got involved in sharing the message of what is called the Black Robed Regiment. I added the word robed. They were originally called the Black Regiment. We'll talk about that in just a second. Is because in about 2008, I began to learn about the preachers of our War of Independence. Now, I knew that Christians played a role, okay? We all kind of knew that most of our founding documents, like the Declaration of Independence and speeches that many of the what I call framers gave, and then if you go all the way back to what I call the founding generation, which would be the Pilgrims, which were really separatists, but we call them Pilgrims. All of those things are Bible-based, right? What I didn't know is that the pastors played such a prominent role that there would not have been a War of Independence. And I don't think there would have been the America that we know today had it not been for the pastors of that era. And the reason why that's so important is because modern pastors have been taught the lie of separation of church and state. So they won't talk about anything political. And I don't mean talking about political as in getting up in the pulpit and all they do is talk politics. I'm talking about the biblical perspective on proper governance, because that's what politics is really supposed to be about. Why in the world would we not want God's view of how to properly govern? I mean, my goodness. Who's the authority on that? Well, the one that dreamed it up, because government is one of the institutions that God created. So the church has disengaged. And over the last 75 or 100 years, there have been multiple generations of Christians who believe that it's wrong to talk about anything political at church. Therefore, they do not hear from their spiritual leaders causes like some of the bills that you just mentioned a while ago. We don't hear about that in church. And it sends the message that those things are not important, and therefore we don't talk about them at church. There couldn't be anything further from the truth. Now, this is not the way America always was, because these pastors called the Black Regiment led out, and as I said, without them, I don't believe that we'd ever had a war. And so artists have tried over the years to capture the involvement of these preachers, and as you can see, most of them would do their ministry wearing some type of black outfit, and typically a robe, a preaching robe. Now, I want you to hear a quote from a historian from 1860. This is John Wingate Thornton. I want you to listen to what he says. To the pulpit, we owe the moral force which won our independence. They prepared for the struggle and went into battle, not as soldiers of fortune, but with the word of God in their hearts and trusting in him. England sent her armies to compel submission, and the colonists appealed to heaven. Now, what I'm going to share with you tonight is just the surface. I spent 2 years writing a lot of the history of these preachers and their role in the war. It's filled with some amazing stories. So I have this book. If you're interested in it, when we're finished, you can get a copy. But I primarily want you to kind of get a gist, the idea. Now, these pastors, as I said, stood in their pulpits every Sunday morning wearing black robes, and you can see these scarves that they wore. Those were called preaching bands. Now, obviously, that's very different from the way we dress today. When I first heard about the Black Robe Regiment, I thought, what are they talking about, judges? It's the only group of people I could think of that wear black robes. No. All preachers, and it didn't matter if you were Baptist, Congregational, Presbyterian, Lutheran, didn't matter. In those days, every preacher would stand in front of their congregation on Sunday morning wearing their black preaching robe. Now, that's going to become very critical in the story of what these guys did. Now, what I just want to do is give you just a smattering of some of the men's stories. There were hundreds of them. I'm just going to give you a few stories so you can see just how pivotal they were. Now, you're looking at a guy named John Peter Gabriel Muhlenberg. Most people know him as Peter Muhlenberg. He grew up in Pennsylvania, at a place called Trapp, Pennsylvania. His father, Henry, helped to found the Lutheran Church in Pennsylvania. Peter Muhlenberg became a pastor down at a place called Woodstock, Virginia, which at that time was considered the frontier. Okay, so he was pastoring in Woodstock, Virginia, but he also served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, because in those days, pastors believed that they had a job to not only minister to their congregations, but to their community and to the culture. So it was not uncommon for pastors to be involved in their, what we would call legislatures. There were pastors involved in the Continental Congress, as we'll see in just a moment. So Muhlenberg served there with a number of Virginians that you might recognize. A gentleman farmer named George Washington, a orator who was also a devout Christian, a man by the name of Patrick Henry. Just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the 250th year of his great speech that he gave on March the 23rd, 1775 in Richmond, Virginia at St. John's Episcopal Church. Now, you may not know that whole speech, but I bet you know the part where he says, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, you can give me liberty." And then he went, "Ooh," and he like stabbing himself, and he said, "Or you can give me death." Now that whole speech was probably the pivotal moment that sparked the move toward independence. It's hard to find one moment, but I think that moment was probably the moment, because you've got all of the government of Virginia gathered in that church listening to Patrick Henry. And the reason they gathered in the church, one, they believed it was a part of their spiritual responsibility, and two, those were normally the largest buildings in the community. So there they are at St. John's Episcopal. He gives that speech. Well, Peter Muhlenberg goes back to his church, and he announces that he's going to step away from the church on January the 21st, 1776. So that Sunday morning, he gets up there wearing his robe. He preaches out of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there's a time for all things. And then, of course, verse 8 says there's a time for war. And then he stepped down and he said, there's a time for all things. There's a time to preach. There's a time to pray. But there's also a time to fight, and that time has come. And then Muhlenberg pulled off his robe. I do this in my live presentation. And underneath, he was wearing a colonel's uniform, because George Washington and Patrick Henry had recommended that he be commissioned as a colonel of a brand new regiment that was forming. It was the 8th Regiment, formed out of the colony of Virginia. So it was simply called the 8th Virginia Regiment. And they fought at most of the major battles of our War of Independence. And there's just a smattering of some of the battles that they were involved in, led by this Lutheran preacher. They did not see a disconnect. They believed that if you don't have liberty, the gospel is going to be censored. The church is going to be collared and handcuffed. And that's exactly what the King of England would have done. In fact, the King of England would have forced all churches to become a part of his church. And remember, the King of England wasn't just the King of England. He was the King of the Church of England. And so he could have forced these guys to either be out or a part of his church. Now, likely it would have been worse than that, because I think he would have executed most of these preachers. And they all knew that, and they knew the stakes. So as you were looking at the list of battles, one of the battles that Muhlenberg fought at was the Battle of Yorktown, which was really the moment, as far as the battles were concerned, where the tide ultimately turned toward victory. That's when they forced Cornwallis to surrender, and it was just a few years the war was over. It pretty much took the fight out of the British. From that point on, they were going backwards, and the Americans were moving forward, which was quite the switch, because the Americans didn't have a chance at the beginning of the war, and they lost. Washington lost his first 8 battles. So this was a big turnaround, which later on they credited the Lord They believe the Lord intervened. Now, this is the painting painted by John Trumbull of the surrender at Yorktown that hangs in the Capitol Rotunda in D.C. I've led many groups there and stood right beneath that painting. That painting's about as long as that wall, if you've never been in the Rotunda, and about 3 times as tall as this ceiling. It's a massive painting, all of those, all the way around the Rotunda, that give poignant moments in our national history. But if you look at this painting, over to the right, notice that there are some men seated on horseback. And if you look right there, that's Peter Muhlenberg. So he was there at the surrender of Yorktown. In fact, he and his men helped to defeat what is called Redoubt Number 10, which was the outward defenses of the British. And once those fell, the way was open and they smashed Cornwallis. He had to surrender, and therefore you have that. It's kind of interesting that if you go back to the actual painting, let me back up here. If you go back to the painting, this is not Cornwallis surrendering. He sent one of his subordinates. He was hiding in fear. So Washington sent one of his subordinates to take the surrender of the British at Yorktown. So you see Washington back there on the horse. He's standing back because Cornwallis is not going to be here. I'm going to back off too. So that's the painting. Muhlenberg is there, but he also has a statue in the Capitol. In the Rotunda, there's something called Statuary Hall. Every state gets to honor 2 of their favorite sons or daughters with statues. They're all around what used to be the old house chamber, and then they're down in what is called the crypt. We'd call it the basement. It's called the crypt because initially they wanted George Washington buried there, and he refused. He wanted to be buried at Mount Vernon, which is where he is buried. So there's no one in the crypt. So the crypt is the other part of Statuary Hall. And down in the crypt, as I said, I've led tour groups there many times. We've stood right at the foot of this marble statue. Pennsylvania chose Peter Muhlenberg as one of their honorees. And if you'll look right here, hanging over his right arm, sword sheathed here over his right arm, the robe that he took off to lead the 8th Virginia. So that's pretty engaged. It's very foreign to modern preachers. Now, it wasn't just a handful. There were literally hundreds of these men. Here is a Presbyterian. His name is James Caldwell. He pastored in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. And he was incredibly outspoken, so much so that the British put a $500 bounty on his head. Now, $500 doesn't sound like a lot today, but $500 then was a huge amount of money. So he would walk into his pulpit every Sunday with 2 loaded flintlock pistols like that one right there, hooked in his belt. His men would come to church armed because they didn't know if the British would raid their services. And so he would pull out both pistols and lay them on the pulpit and preach his sermon with the pistols laying there. And then when he was finished, he'd take his pistols and hook them back in and go over to what we'd call the front of the back door, depending on what side of it you're on, and greet his members. That's just the kind of guy he was. Well, you'd say, well, surely the British weren't serious about arresting him. Oh, they were dead serious. In fact, when they invaded Elizabethtown, one of the redcoats shot through the window of their home and killed his wife, Hannah Caldwell, hit her right in the chest and killed her in cold blood. So he helped to do her funeral, and then he had to scoot on over to Springfield, New Jersey, because his men were engaging the British there. And when he got there, he found out that they were out of wadding. Now, I don't know, most of you probably are pretty familiar with firearms, but if you're not as familiar with these flintlocks, they're muzzle loaders, so you have to load them through the barrel, and then of course you have to put powder in what is called the flash pan. If you didn't have wadding to hold the shot tight down in the barrel, we have wadding today, especially in shotgun loads. Hold that shot tight. These things were rendered pretty much useless, and so what are they going to do? So Caldwell jumps on his horse and he rides down to the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield, runs inside, and gathers up all the hymn books that he can carry. And he rides back to his men and he begins to throw those, I don't know why that just jumped like that. He begins to throw those hymn books out to his men. And those hymn books had songs in them written by a very famous hymn writer in those days named Isaac Watts. If you've ever sung the song, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, that's an Isaac Watts hymn. So these hymn books that he's throwing out here have Isaac Watts hymns in them. So this Presbyterian preacher is standing there throwing out hymn books at his men, tearing the men to tear out the pages and use the paper and the pages for wadding. So they're firing away at the British with Isaac Watts songs shoved down the muskets of their flintlocks, all the while the preacher's yelling, "Give 'em Watts, boys, give 'em Watts." That's a Presbyterian preacher, James Caldwell. Or if you move to the Battle of Brandywine. At the Battle of Brandywine, George Washington wanted a preacher to preach a sermon before the next day when they figured the battle was going to occur, because the Americans are on one side of Brandywine Creek, the British on the other. And so a young preacher, 25 years old, Joab Trout, preached a sermon to the men to give them the courage to fight the next day. Muhlenberg was there, George Washington was there, many of the men were there, and he finished his sermon by crying out, "And God prosper the cause." And the very next day at the Battle of Brandywine, that preacher, along with all the other Americans, fought the British at the Battle of Brandywine, and that preacher was killed that day at Brandywine. 25-year-old preacher. Peter Muhlenberg was there. So again, you can see the involvement of the preachers. So King George knew the role that the preachers were playing. In fact, he called it a Presbyterian rebellion. He was blaming it on the Presbyterians. But it wasn't just the Presbyterians. If you do the study, you'll find out that it was preachers from practically every denomination. Now, they didn't have as many denominations as we have today, but practically from every denomination, pretty much without all of them but the Catholics. And the Catholics were helping raise money for the American cause. But all the other denominations sent preachers to the battlefield. And so then they, of course, became so effective that the British began to target the preachers. And man, they were public enemy number one. And in my book, I have excerpts from letters that they write back home while they're out in the field, telling their families that if they get caught by the British, they know that they'll be hanged for treason. I mean, these guys knew the price that they were going to pay if they were captured. They knew how dangerous, but they believed in liberty enough to do it. Now, we're talking about preachers and men from their churches. When Muhlenberg did his thing at his church, many of his men signed up and were a part of the 8th Virginia Regiment. All these guys were this way. So an American by the name of Peter Oliver, he was a Tory. Now, if you remember, the Tories were the ones who sided with the British, sometimes called loyalists. They were considered turncoats by the Americans. But Peter Oliver came up with the term Black Regiment. And what he was referring to was the robes that these guys wore when they preached. And so they began to really target the preachers. Now, don't misunderstand, there wasn't a regiment of preachers. It was preachers leading regiments, like Muhlenberg's leading the 8th Virginia Regiment. But that's where the title came from, Black Regiment. And I simply call it the Black Robed Regiment so that people will know kind of what I'm talking about, not something racist. We're talking about guys wearing black robes. So let me give you another story. On April the 18th, 1775, a number of horsemen rode out across the Massachusetts countryside, and one of those was named Revere. Of course, you just held one of his pistols a while ago, Paul Revere. And that night, he rides to Lexington to warn everyone that the regulars are coming. Now, we say the British, but that's not what they would have said. They would have said the regulars. So the regulars are coming. So he rides up to that house, and you say, well, what's so important about that house? That's where the preacher of Lexington, Massachusetts lived. His name is Jonas Clark. Jonas Clark had been training the men of his church how to fight together as soldiers. In fact, an old veteran of the French and Indian War who was a deacon at Jonas Clark's church, John Parker, was helping him train these citizens. And so Revere rides to that house because he wants to warn them that the British are on their way. And that night, Preacher Clark had two special guests spending the night with him. Samuel Adams, who was the founder and the leader of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, and John Hancock. And the interesting thing about this church is that John Hancock's grandfather had pastored that very church a few years before and had lived in that parsonage where now Jonas Clark is living. So they invite Revere in, and they have a little council of war, and they begin to decide, what are we going to do? The British are coming this way. They knew they were going to Concord. But if you've ever been there, the road goes straight through Lexington and then forks right where Jonas Clark's church would have sat. and you go to the right to go to Concord. So they knew they were going to march right by the church. So they asked him, will the men fight? And Jonas Clark, the preacher, said, I trained them for this very hour. They will fight, and if need be, die too, under the shadow of the house of God. So what they were going to do is they were going to make a stand. So about 77 men showed up the next morning on April the 19th. So, you know, we're right on the top of that 250th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. This is a statue of Captain Parker that stands right about where Jonas Clark's church was. So if you coming into Lexington, if you've ever heard about the Lexington Green, it's pie-shaped. And right at the point where the roads fork is where Clark's church sat, and right behind it in the green area is where they fought the Battle of Lexington. So all of this is a deacon of the church of Jonas Clark. So about 77 Lexington men show up that morning. Now they're not going to fire at the redcoats. In fact, the preachers had told them, God will only honor our efforts if our fighting is defensive. God will not honor it if we draw first blood. So what they were going to do is they were going to stand there by the road as the British marched by, holding their flintlock, showing them, we're not going to take this sitting down. We're going to stand up for our rights. Unfortunately, though, a shot is fired. Now, this is the command that Captain Parker gave his men. In fact, this is a boulder right there in Lexington Green today. And here's what he said to his men. He said, stand your ground, men. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. So as they're standing there, the redcoats have already loaded their flintlocks. In fact, about a quarter of a mile before they got to the Lexington men, they were commanded to halt and charge their muskets, which means load them. Now, there were about 700 or 800 of those redcoats. So 700 or 800 men loading muskets is going to make a lot of noise. Do you realize how intimidating that would have been to those 77 Lexington men? They're outnumbered 10 to 1. Now, they're not intending to fire on them. Okay, they're just intending to make a statement here. So it was kind of a stalemate. Nobody fired anything. So Captain Parker and Preacher Clark told the men, we've made our point. You guys go back to your homes. As the Lexington men began to walk away from the redcoats, a pistol was fired. No one to this day knows who fired the pistol. Typically, only officers carried pistols. Most people did not own pistols. You had to be fairly wealthy to own a pistol, generally in those days. So likely it was a British officer. Unfortunately, the redcoat soldiers took that shot as the signal to open fire, and they began to shoot at the Lexington men initially into their backs. Well, the Lexington men turned and defended themselves. And now you have the Battle of Lexington, lasts for about 15 minutes, and that really is the shot heard around the world, not at Concord. That happens later that day. Right there at Lexington, and those men then fight that battle right there in what I would call the churchyard of Jonas Clark's church. It's the meeting house of Lexington. And I just want you to think about it. How fitting is it that the first official fight of Americans against the British were Americans led by a preacher and a deacon fighting it out in the churchyard? Because that's exactly what happened at the Battle of Lexington. When the battle was over, 8 Minutemen had done just what the preacher had said they would do. They would die under the shadow of the house of God. They fought in the churchyard. And another 10 had been wounded. And then, of course, the British went on over to Concord. But by then, Revere and the other guys had gotten the warning out, and they had hidden all the ammunition out in the woods. And so the only thing that the redcoats found was the American Continental Militia standing up on Barrett Hill, which overlooks the Old North Bridge. And that's where the Battle of Concord was basically fought. And here's another kicker. A preacher lived 200 yards from the Old North Bridge. His name was Preacher William Emerson. And you may recognize the name because his grandson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, became a famous poet and wrote what is called the Concord Hymn, which is where we get our phrase, shot heard around the world. And so he's up there and he tells those men at Concord the same thing that Parker had told the men at Lexington, yet they didn't know what each other had said. He said, let us stand our ground. If we die, let us die here. And then the colonists marched down off of Barrett Hill, engaged the British, and the Battle of Concord was fought. And so you have, once again, preachers playing major roles. Let me tell you about one more battle. This is a painting by John Trumbull, the same guy that painted the surrender at Yorktown. This is a famous scene, out of the battle of what we call Bunker Hill. Basically, it was fought on Breed's Hill, and then Bunker Hill was where it came to an end. But I want to draw your attention to this area right here. So if you'll notice that area, notice that there's a man surrounded by flags and upturned muskets. And if you look really closely, notice what he's wearing. Can you see those? Those are those preaching bands. Well, who is that? Well, that is preacher Samuel McClintock. He's a pastor from New Hampshire, and his family was so committed to liberty that 3 of his 4 sons died in the war. He's there fighting at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he wasn't the only preacher who was there. David Avery was there from Vermont. There were preachers involved in the battle at Bunker Hill. And so why did Trumbull put him in the painting? Because he wanted people to know in the generations to follow the key role that preachers played in fighting for our independence. And then this is Naphtali Daggett. He was a preacher and the president of Yale, which was started primarily as a Christian school. It's far from that now, but it's initially a Christian school. In fact, he had about 100 boys from the school when the British were coming in to invade New Haven, Connecticut, rode out and fired a few shots at them to slow them down so the citizens could get out of town. They captured him, the British captured him, the preacher, and they knew who he was, and beat him so brutally that he never recovered. He died a few months later. The president of Yale. So these guys knew what was at stake. Here's a preacher from Durham, New Hampshire called John Adams. He and his men, before the war started, gathered up all the ammunition and hid it so the British couldn't find it. And they hid the gunpowder, hundreds of pounds of gunpowder, under his pulpit. So every Sunday when he's up there preaching, he's standing on hundreds of pounds of gunpowder, hiding it from the British. And I'll just throw a few other names up here. John Treadwell kept a loaded flintlock musket in his pulpit. He would walk up into the pulpit on Sundays with his Bible tucked under one arm and his cartridge box under the other. John Steele from Cumberland, Pennsylvania, recruited as many as 3,000 soldiers to join the Continental Army. Jonathan French, Andover, Massachusetts, he was a pastor. When he heard about Bunker Hill, he resigned his church like Muhlenberg did, went home and got his flintlock and his medical bag and joined the army. Preachers. See, this is a part of our history that we haven't been taught. This is Benjamin Trumbull. He was from North Haven, Connecticut, as you can see. He fought as a soldier at the Battle of White Plains when bullets and bombs are bursting all around him. This is preacher Thomas Allen from Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He was not only the chaplain, but he was the commander of what was called the Berkshire Militia. And at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, on August the 16th, 1777, that preacher, Allen, led his men out of the battlefield wearing his preaching robe. He was wearing his black robe and walked out in between the space between the two armies and jumped up on a stump and called out to the British and gave them the opportunity to surrender before he told his men to open fire. And the British fired at him and missed him, but put a hole in his head. So he went back. It was a miracle that they didn't kill him. Went back, stood beside his brother Joseph, and he and his brother fought all day long at the Battle of Bennington, Vermont. Another preacher. And so over and over and over, you see this resounding theme here. So a few historians, and then I'll kind of wrap it up, see if you have any questions. This is Frank Moore. Notice he wrote this in 1862. This is a book entitled The Patriot Preachers of the American Revolution. Most people don't know anything about this history. But if you go back far enough, historians were writing about these men and telling about their stories. So listen to what he says. The preachers of the Revolution did not hesitate to attack the great political and social evils of their day. The average preacher today won't touch those subjects with a 10-foot pole. But notice he says those preachers did, and we better be glad they did, or we would not have the liberties that we are, at least be able to enjoy the liberties that we do. And then I mentioned Thornton earlier. Let me give you another quote from his. He said, the fathers of the Republic did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly. Now the emphasis I've added myself. The point is, that's the opposite of what we're told today. See, we're told if you mix church and state, you've sinned. That generation said you've sinned if you don't. Because they understood the connection. I mean, after all, who do we want to have govern us? Godless heathens or Christians? Moral people. And I don't have time to go into this, but if you study the framers, I do a whole presentation on it. the framers were banking on the church being effective enough that America remained moral, because they said if we don't stay moral, we can't be free. You remember the famous quote from John Adams, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the government of any other." What he was saying is, if you're not moral, you can't govern yourself. Somebody else has to govern you because you're immoral. So the framers understood the connection, and that's why these guys are so important. That's why every American needs to know the story of the Black-Robed Regiment. Certainly every Christian, and my hope and prayer would be many preachers. And that's why I travel and do the full-blown presentation, because I act it out. So what you've seen is just a little scratching of the surface of the story of the Black Regiment. But I think you can see that these guys were major players. They were really involved. Many of them were killed on the battlefield. Some of them, while they were trying to surrender, I act that out at the very end of my presentation. A guy named John Rosbrook, who was a preacher in Delaware, was trying to surrender to the British and the Hessians, and while he was surrendering, they bayoneted him to death. These guys were public enemy number one. So this is the book on that. I've also written a book entitled Unlimited Submission with a question mark, because the most often asked question that I've been asked over the years when it comes to this subject is, well, doesn't Paul say in Romans chapter 13 that we're supposed to bend over and knuckle under? Isn't it a sin to stand up against authority? Well, if you read Romans 13, in my opinion, incorrectly, yeah. But if you read it correctly, that's not what Romans 13 teaches. So I've written just a small book on that to deal with that very subject. So that's very, very useful. And then we have a filmed on site. It's kind of a docudrama. I'm in period costume, and we go to different places. There's a lot of drama. In fact, there's a 7-minute little short movie that begins it by putting you in the pews of one of these preachers and hearing them speak. And the preacher is actually a Hollywood actor. His wife is an actress. These are all reenactors. It's very well done. The sermon is just snippets, are actually from election sermons from that period, from preachers. See, you guys have never heard an election sermon. Preachers used to preach election sermons all the time. So then we just go into the history. So this is available. If someone wouldn't read the book, then maybe they would watch the movie. And so it's a 90-minute documentary, basically. And we have it in Blu-ray or the regular DVD. Okay, so that's the story of the Black Regiment. And that gives you a little introduction to who they were and why they were important. And I can tell you right now, if the church was engaged today, like the church was then, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in today. I can tell you that right now. And I've been in the legislature. I've been behind the curtain. I've been in the smoke-filled rooms. I've watched the sausage being made. And if you knew what really happens down on Lincoln in Oklahoma City, if you really knew, you and the rest of your citizens would be down there with pitchforks and torches, and you'd burn the place down. Some of the most godless stuff you can imagine is happening in our so-called conservative state, in our legislature. So it's why the church needs to re-engage. So that's why this subject's so important. You guys have any questions?